right. And welcome back, guys, to the Self-Selecting Podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it. Today, we're doing something a little different than our regular jam. First, real quick, if you are tuning in from Spotify, from Apple, do me a favor, leave me a review. This helps so much. YouTube, like, comment, subscribe. So this is a little bit before it's being posted. We're doing great. The podcast is growing. This is getting in front of more people every single week. So I'm happy. I'm happy. I'm happy to hear the feedback, happy to read the comments. Like, comment, subscribe. If you are on YouTube, it helps so much with the algorithm. Yes, I am still accepting coaching clients. You do not have to be someone who is looking to get on stage, by the way. And I know I talk a lot about competing. I talk a lot about what it takes to get like gnarly conditioning. But realistically, the amount of people that I work with that are like, yo, I have no desire to do that, but I want to be treated. I want to be treated like a competitor. I want that attention to detail. I want all of the data, all of the quantitative data, all the quantitative, qualitative, both of those. I want the feedback. I want the eye. We can do that. And I know here, like, we're at the end of summer at this point. So it's one of those things that can feel like, well, fuck, like I missed the boat. Like, should I just wait till next year? No, you should not, because I'm telling you, it'll come quicker than you think. And the worst thing, some of the worst advice I've been given is, just wrap it up. Like, it's August, September. Okay, cool. Just like wait until next spring to really get into the best shape of your life. Don't do that. I mean, like, what else are you going to do in the time in between? What, you're just going to just dick around all through the holidays, gain a bunch of weight while you're visiting family, while you're on vacation, whatever it is that you're doing. The holidays are probably the time where things get rocky. And the thing that I think has helped me the most with managing a lot of travel, but more specifically like holiday events, social events, last quarter of the year, is going into that in a place where I feel like I know what I'm going to do. Like I have a game plan, and it's not going to be a free for all. Like, I know, hey, generally there are going to be days where I'm a little bit over, but I know how to combat that. And that really is, I would say, one of the areas that I help the most with is setting you up on a plan that, one, makes sense, but two, is something that you can see. Like you get the timeline, and you can just see at that point, like, hey, this is the target rate of change. And if you're not hitting this, if we're not on track to hit that, well, then we course correct, and we course correct in real time. It's not one of those things. It's not going to take like 6 weeks for me to figure out your body. Like, I promise you, this stuff works. No clients I've worked with have not been able to lose fat. That's not something that I mean, personally, it's not something I believe in. It's not something that I think you have to live in a state of. It's not something I think, frankly, is a good excuse. If you feel like you're stuck and you feel like, at this point, like you've tried everything, let me know. Set up a 15-minute free consultation with me. I do that for all potential coaching clients, but that is not the only service that I offer. I also offer one-on-one consultations. Now, these are also not limited to just competitors. Yes, if you're a competitor, if you have a coach, if you're someone who's like, yo, I got it covered. Like, we got like most of it covered, but we don't have the lab work covered, or we don't have the PEDs covered. And you're just like, I need a second eye. I need to know that what I'm doing is not complete dog shit. I do that. And you can bring your coach, you can bring your partner, whatever it is, whatever the needs are that you want the second eye on, let me know. But with consultations, you're not locked into anything. It's not something that you necessarily have to be like, okay, I'm going to pay for 6 months of these up front. It's on an as needed basis. So this can be every time that you get lab work done. It can be every time that you need an adjustment. Both of those services can be found in the show notes below. What did I say? We're doing something different today. Today we are doing a Q&A from Instagram. So if you got your questions in, sit tight. We're going to be going through all of the PED questions today. Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and enjoy. All right. What effects should we see from Anavar? Okay, so realistically, Anavar is going to help you build muscle. That's the effect I would say you should hope to see. It's something that, frankly, I think it's oftentimes used in a place where muscle growth isn't really likely to occur, given that it's often used in a competition setting or in a steep fat loss setting. Just because it's used that way doesn't mean that it's the best use for it. And I would say more often than not, people are sleeping on the biggest benefits that it can offer. It's an anabolic. So, I mean, any kind of anabolic, it's going to be best utilized in order to build muscle. Yes, it's going to offset protein catabolism, so it's going to offer anti-catabolic properties, obviously, but is that the best use for it? Is that the thing you should expect to see? Is that the thing that you're going to write home about? I mean, like, I think it's really poor use for it, personally. Sure, Anavar does work in certain pathways that are related to fat loss, but again, is that where it shines? Is that the best use for it? No, not really. And if you're a female athlete, if you're someone who's like, I'm not looking to be like a top Olympian, I'm not looking to be like a competitive physique athlete, I just want to put on some muscle in the right areas so that I feel a little more complete. Well, yeah, an anabolic is going to expedite that process. In terms of the actual effects, like what can you expect to see from it? Well, it depends. Depends how well you are doing all the basics in terms of driving muscle growth. Are you creating an environment that is conducive with growing? So basic things. I mean, you got to have your nutrition in check. And I mean, like I hate that it sounds so abstract and ambiguous, but essentially if we're looking at gaining a pound a week, which is like pretty aggressive, it's a 500 calorie surplus a day. So if we're wanting to half that, okay, half a pound a week, that's pretty reasonable. Some would still argue maybe a little too aggressive because, I mean, realistically, how much of that is muscle? How much of that is body fat? When you consider that, and you consider that that's just a 250 calorie surplus, so 250 calories above your maintenance, that's where you have to really be honest with yourself, and you need to kind of move through your growth phase with integrity around how accurate is your food reporting. Are you having meals that ultimately make it to where maybe global adherence is not as tight as it should be? And that's if you're someone who's like, hey, I'm trying to minimize the amount of body fat gain that I incur as I go through the growth phase. But if that's the case, I mean, like we're talking about like putting this in place to expedite muscle growth. Well, yeah, like you need to be in a surplus. Do you need to be in an excessive surplus? Is it going to be much harder for you to grow with an anabolic as opposed to not having an anabolic in place, as opposed to naturally? No, it's going to be easier. So I would say even that particularly being said, if you have the anabolic in place, your food needs to be even more tightly controlled for the fact that like you can get away with really mitigating that unnecessary fat gain. In terms of how much you're looking to build, I mean, that's really going to come down to your history, your training history. How much of your natural potential have you maxed out? Are you on a program right now that's resulting in muscle growth? And if so, what is that rate of change? I think it's really important to ensure that if you're going to be putting the anabolic, that you are seeing a positive trend in weight gain and that the weight that's coming on is of high quality, meaning more muscle relative to fat. But if that's the case, I would kind of say like, well, what is the point of the anabolic? And if you're still seeing progress, why put the anabolic in place? I mean, I get it in the case that you're someone who's like, I'm trying to expedite that process. I'm trying to get even more out of it. But realistically, I mean, you put it in place. The longest you really should have it in place is like 8-ish weeks. Some people are going to be short of that. Some people are going to go a little longer. How much muscle can you realistically expect to build during that time? And this is even more pressing of a question if you're an athlete who is already trained, if you already have a lot of muscle tissue, if you're on a really sound program and you've kind of pulled all of your levers in terms of, periodizing your training to incur the necessary stimulus to create those adaptations. All in all, I mean, like you still need to do these things, but the actual rate of change that you can expect, even with doing everything correct, is going to largely depend on your runway as an individual. What is the difference in where you currently are as opposed to the amount of muscle, like the max capacity that you should carry on your frame? So hard to answer. I think I avoided answering that almost entirely. So blanketly, what I'll say, it's best use. What you should expect, the effect that you should hope to get from it is to build muscle. Would 1 ml of Primo a week cause virilization? Well, I mean, like realistically, it very well could, depending on what that dose is in milligrams. So this is something that I think a lot of people, they get tripped up on. They tend to talk about their doses of anabolics in total volume, in mLs, how much is actually going into the syringe. Now, this is a problem because it's not universal. Like 1 ml of Primo is not universally the same amount. And this is really going to come down to the concentration per ml in the bottle. So I would highly recommend looking at your bottle, finding those numbers, the 100 milligrams, 150, whatever it is, find that, and then do the med math for that. How many mLs are you doing? You're doing 1 ml. Okay, so if you're using 100 milligrams per week, will that cause virilization? It could. Very well could. It depends. What is your definition of virilization? And this isn't my way of again, avoiding the question, but I know that for me, like if I were to begin to hear my voice change, that would be something I'd be like, well, we're going to pump the brakes. No longer going to be using that drug. We're going to discontinue because ultimately, if you were experiencing virilization, if that's something that is, a new onset of these effects, the only way to really reduce the probability that they continue to progress is to discontinue the drug. Now, if we're talking about someone who is, less risk averse, they're like, you know what, I don't really give a shit if my voice changes. If you're in one of the upper divisions and you're like, hey, this is actually really low dose compared to what a lot of women in my realm are using. Okay, maybe based on your aspirations, 1 ml, or in this case, this example, 100 milligrams per week, maybe that's not a lot. I would say generally for bikini, that's like triple the starting dose. So, I mean, it's also relative to what anabolics you've used previously and whether or not there's been any kind of sign or indication that you have virilized based on that dose, based on that duration. To expand on this, and really, I know, some people get annoyed. They're like, just, single answers. That's what I want. I'm like, yeah, but the context, honestly, it really does matter. So if we're talking about someone who's using 1 ml of Primo for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, I don't know, maybe you're using it for a show to drive, a fuller look. I'm not even saying you should. So please take that with a grain of salt. But in the case you're using it for a very short duration, there's the chance that dose isn't going to be strong enough to cause virilization. But it's not to say everyone's going to be safe from using higher doses, even for short durations. So completely individualized, assess those changes, assess prior unwanted effects that you've incurred and the prevalence in which you've incurred effects can be revealing in some cases. But again, that's not a universal system. Do you keep the gains after a cycle of Anavar, or do you go flat even with constant work? Okay, so kind of the same answer here as the last two. It really depends on the quality of tissue or size or weight that you've added during your cycle. There are people that have put anabolics in place. These are people, the very specific people I'm thinking of, who have gone on cycle, used it, gotten, seemingly a better look from that drug, from the exposure, but removing it, they almost look identical to how they did prior to use. Now, why does this happen? Why do people go flat, or why do people seemingly look, they revert to the physique they had prior to the use of the anabolic? Typically, that's because they didn't actually put on tissue. So in the case of someone who, let's say, is using it in a time where they're not doing what's necessary to grow, they're not recovering, they're not staying hydrated, their training is just kind of dog shit. They're doing the same thing in and out. And, maybe the reason they used the anabolic was to drive muscle growth. Hopefully that was the reason. But they weren't in a position prior to using the anabolic where they weren't in a position before using the anabolic that would lend to the belief that the anabolic was going to accelerate that growth. Now, this could be because, even though the anabolic will improve training performance, let's say they modified their entire training program, they switched to some kind of, just senseless split where they're very far away from true failure. Maybe they're not exposing themselves nearly as much, or getting exposed to a point in their training close to failure, to the appropriate intensity where they're driving those adaptations. And if that's the case, well then it's not to say that you got nothing out of it. Maybe there was some kind of like recomping type effect. But for the female athlete, I think that's a really poor use for the drug itself. I think that there's a lot that can be gained and a lot of changes that can be made to the physique with using an anabolic. But that's under the pretense that you are using it to build new tissue. If you are not doing something prior to using the anabolic that is supportive of you growing, if you don't have a plan in place that is driving growth, it's unlikely just simply putting the anabolic in itself, like that exclusively, is going to be enough to just add tissue. It will increase training performance. So if you capitalize on that avenue, sure, in theory, you should, but not everyone does. Best cycle for females after running Anavar: less virilization, less side effects. Okay, so this is really going to come down to using things that are not anabolic, so our non-androgenic PEDs. And I wouldn't even necessarily call this a cycle or say that this is like a one size fits all, because really when we talk about the non-androgenic PEDs, we're talking a lot of fat loss tools. So clenbuterol, thyroid hormone, let's just throw in yohimbine in there as well. Okay, so all of these, they can be utilized in a fat loss phase to get you closer to that goal of losing body fat. But if your goal is to build muscle and you're throwing things in place that, let's say, increase decrease your energy balance, so put you from maybe a surplus back to maintenance, or take you from maintenance into a deficit, I wouldn't consider that very effective. Now, if your goal from using an anabolic is to go into a fat loss phase, if you're like, hey, I'm going to remove the anabolic, hold for a week or two, and then I'm going to go into like a mini cut, sure, that would make sense. But really, the way that you approach this decision is, if you want no side effects, if you want no virilization, none at all, you are going to stay safe, relatively safe, using non-anabolics. So clenbuterol, yohimbine, T4, GH is one that you can use whether you're in a fat loss phase or growth phase. And I think it's really important, if you're going to be using an anabolic, assuming that you don't have any contraindications, it could make sense to put GH in place. I'm a big fan of GH. I think it definitely has a place in the enhanced female athletes protocol, but this is really going to come down to what the goal is and how you plan to attack that. If we're talking about someone who's like, hey, I used Anavar and now what I want to do is I want to move into a different portion of a growth phase, but I don't want to continue with the Anavar exclusively. Really, my question is going to come down to, do you have TRT in place? And if you don't have TRT in place, well, I think the first thing that you need to do post-cycle, check your test levels, check all of your sex hormones. Yes, check your DHEA. It's one that I think is often overlooked, but in order to make the appropriate selection of, compound or decide not to move forward with a compound, you need to know whether or not that, in theory, a low test is actually caused by a deficiency in DHEA as well. So you kind of work yourself backwards up the chain and see, okay, where is the deficiency really prevalent? And that can help you make decisions around what compound you would need post-Anavar cycle. Did you learn a lot from Victor Black PED related? Okay, so I get questioned about Victor a lot, and I say a lot, but I really don't. I get it every now and again, but frequent enough. And, for those of you who don't know, I went through J3U, and I think I'm still subbed as a part of Masterclass, but a lot of the PED knowledge that I've gained has been directly from J3U. It's not to say that I haven't gone through Victor's female lectures. I have, but I think for accuracy, it's really important to specify where the knowledge is coming from. Now, within J3U, yes, John has J3U, just the primary, the OG J3U. That was the one I went through prior to the female module. When I went through the female module, I was already working for John. And I mean, that was something that, very fortunate. He asked, for some of my input on certain components of that. But largely the female module is teaching Victor Black's education around female PED use. So I think that's where like people can kind of get bent out of shape, and they can have opinions around like, well, why don't you credit Victor Black more? Okay, so first, the amount of content I put out, I do give him a lot of credit. I know a lot of people on his post have been like, yo, but it's not like listed in your ebooks or anything like that. First of all, I got one ebook, one free ebook that is just blatantly out there for people to download if you're interested in that. It's on my website, CoreyVit.com. You can go and download that. But yeah, no, generally I do give Victor more credit than within this technicality of like, okay, who deserves the credit? Like I have shouted him out quite a bit. So in the instance of someone asking, like, did you learn directly from Victor? Yeah, I've consumed his content. Yes, the models that I am teaching, that I'm sharing, let's just like be clear about that I'm sharing the knowledge with others, largely stem from J3U, which J3U, the female portion of that, is based on the Black models. Is it really possible to make it far in women's bodybuilding if I want to stay natty? That depends. If we're talking about like women's bodybuilding, like truly the bodybuilding division for the female, like within female divisions, not if you want to be competitive. No, I mean like in the NPC and the IFBB, those athletes are very, very much enhanced. And I don't think that's anything like that necessarily needs to be like laid out. It's just very clear, at least in my opinion, that those athletes, like the amount of muscularity that they carry and the conditioning requirements of the division do warrant the use of PEDs. But I would say really all of the divisions do, with the exception of bikini. Like, I mean, at the amateur level, certainly there's a large degree of the physique, like the target physique that can be built without PEDs. Yet when we start getting into the pro ranks, within the last several years, the look has evolved to something that I would say is much more difficult to attain naturally. And it's not to say like blankly across the board, even for bikini, you have to use drugs, relative, big asterisk in the pro division. But I think that's something that should be mentioned, is that the use of PEDs within the pro division of bikini have become more prevalent, and thereby the looks that are being brought to stage and being awarded are becoming what appear to be more enhanced. So it depends on your goal. It depends on what you deem as competitive, what you deem as success. I think a lot of people get caught up in the actual like awards process of like, how did I place? And like, frankly, we can't say that placing in itself is the only metric that someone, I mean, again, completely my opinion, go ahead and shit on me if you don't agree, but I think that there's a lot that you can gain outside of actual placing. And yes, while you should strive to obviously be successful on stage, I don't think it's as simple as just having the best physique, having the densest physique, having the best conditioning, or being at the lowest body fat percentage, because those physiques are oftentimes not awarded. It really, within the bikini division, you need to have a combination of density, conditioning, shape, structure. And I mean, again, I know it sounds like very ambiguous. I'm like, oh, just like have the right balance. That's going to look different on each person. I mean, just like structurally based on like how you are built, and the degree of muscularity you have, and your predisposition to store body fat. That can be something that is seemingly much harder for certain athletes, who are, let's just say, disadvantaged in how they were built or in where they store body fat. But I would say, if you're looking to be successful, this starts with identifying what you consider success. If you're just looking to beat your last physique last time you were on stage, okay, yeah, like, I mean, I think that's a very good goal. And I think that you can do so in a way that coincides with placing better show to show. I think that's where you do have to adhere to the criteria of your division. So in the case of someone who is wanting to exclusively place better and you're in one of the divisions that has a higher muscularity requirement, or a lower body fat percentage, as a standard average, or, just the conditioning requirements are higher, greater than that of bikini or wellness, you should expect that in order to do that, it likely will require the use of PEDs. Is it possible to experience depression and anxiety while taking Anavar? I don't think that Anavar in itself is going to cause depression or anxiety. I think if you're someone who's like predisposed to experiencing either of those, then yeah, I mean, Anavar can certainly enhance something that is already present. I don't think it's going to change who you are, and it's essentially going to be a catalyst in that regard. But I would say if you're someone who, let's say you are on and off, you go through bouts of depression and you can't really pinpoint the cause, using any kind of enhancements, they're going to enhance those lows and those highs. Now, I personally like having used Anavar, having grown without Anavar. I feel like, Anavar in itself, that's something that has enhanced my training, specifically. It's enhanced my ability in the gym, which in turn, it feels really good. It is very motivating. So I would actually say the opposite from just like a mechanistic standpoint. If you do derive a lot of motivation and drive based on your training, that's something that I wouldn't go as far to say could combat depression, not saying that, but I personally find that like in times where like I've been very low and like I felt very demotivated, getting my training to a point where I can make meaningful progress, over the course of several months. That in itself has, it's mitigated some of those lows for me. Complete anecdote. I wouldn't link Anavar with causing any kind of mental illness, but I would say if you're someone who's prone to depressive episodes, or if you run anxious to begin with, it would definitely be something I would consider, and I would consider prior to using Anavar. I would also ensure that in the midst of like, if you're like, I really want to use Anavar, but I don't want it to enhance, these feelings. Well, it might be a good idea to pinpoint the root and do your best to mitigate potential culprits so that when you're using Anavar, you don't find that, these unexpected challenges or I guess catalyst pull you into one of those episodes. In what situation would Masteron be preferred over Anavar? So in the case that someone, let's just say we're talking a female athlete, but also a male athlete, we're talking about someone who is opting for an injectable. So in that case, it would be Primobolan or Masteron. So I would approach the decision making around like which anabolics would you pick. You got Anavar, Primo, Masteron. In the case of someone who's looking to grow, which that's really the use for all three of them, I would go with the injectable in the setting in which you are not in a contest prep. In contest prep, sure, if you're using an anabolic to enhance the look, like cosmetically, you're looking to just bring a fuller look, which I talked about this a few episodes back when I was explaining and like sharing my prior use of Anavar. It was used in a setting where I wasn't going to build muscle, but it was used to augment the physique that I, had already brought to stage. The feedback was very much come in fuller. And I mean, like seemingly you look at me next to the other competitors, it was much smaller. So it was like, okay, you got a few weeks before your next show, putting in 5 milligrams of Anavar. Sure, you're going to bring a fuller look, but it wasn't just like bring the Anavar in, continue the deficit, and okay, that results in the fuller look. I actually was like very, very stringent with periodizing like the carbs and like day to day. I was just like repeating what I was going to do for show, taking pictures, finding the look, making it very repeatable. Yes, that was with the use of Anavar, which is not what the drug's called. Is that Remington James or is that Greg Doucette? It's one of their little protein treats, or it was at one point. Anyways, I digress. In the case that you were using something to just like artificially create a fuller look, Anavar would be your pick. In the case that you were using something in a growth phase, so in the off season, Primobolan or Masteron, those are both injectables, and those are going to be ones that are going to be more appropriate in that setting. Now, why would you pick Masteron over Anavar, which was the original question? Well, in that case, I mean, like if you were questioning whether the Primobolan is actually Primo, if you're like, listen, like I don't trust the sourcing. Like, I mean, like I know other girls who've gone through this person and they've reported like, kind of dicey effects, and like it's just not something I feel comfortable with. Okay, well then using Mastron could definitely be an option. But I would say blanketly, there are certain individuals who have at least reported that Mastron does pose more of an androgenic-like effect. Like the androgenic effects are a little more prevalent than Primo. I haven't used either. So, I mean, like I can't speak from personal experience, but I can say I've had clients use both Primo, both Mastron. I've had clients use both drugs, not simultaneously. I've had clients who have used Primo and not experienced androgenic effects. I've had clients who've used Mastron and not experienced androgenic effects. So this is something that you may have to explore. And because of that, again, for the risk-averse female athlete, I would make sure that you were starting at a low enough dose so you're not overshooting. It's much more favorable to titrate up versus down. So in that case, yeah, if you're trying Mastron for the first time and, it seems like it's a better option for you, cool, go with it. But I would definitely be cautious and have the tools in place to at least monitor for the onset of the androgenic side effects. Have you had many people experience bad rebound when coming off of T3? No, not necessarily. I find that coming off of T3, I mean, like when we're really looking at like, okay, mechanistically, what does it do? It's something that's going to support it's exogenous T3. I mean, like it's supporting thyroid function in the case that someone is using an appropriate dose. So, I mean, T3, that's 12.5-ish micrograms. I mean, like if you're running very, very high doses, 25 micrograms. 50 micrograms. I've heard of these doses, and I know people who are on these doses for an extended duration. If that's the case, well, yeah, I mean, like the drop off might feel pretty abrupt. I would put things in place that ultimately, like I would put supplements in place that are supportive of regaining thyroid function. So something like selenium would be a good idea. Really though, when we're talking about supporting thyroid function, we want to do things that are going to allow you to drop off fatigue. So let's say you were to discontinue thyroid hormone in the middle of a contest prep. Well, no, fatigue is going to be really high and you still have a lot of inputs that are driving the stimulus in order to signal to your body that like, hey, we're not really in a great position to keep the metabolism firing on all cylinders. Now, in the case of someone who is discontinuing post-show, sure, there might be a little bit of a lag, but in terms of like a hard rebound, I tend to be pretty skeptical when people say that because I mean, really the first question I have to ask is like, okay, how accurate is food reporting whenever you're coming off thyroid hormone? Which this is the time where I would really make sure, like, I get it, like it's hard post-show and it's one of those things that your hunger signaling is, seemingly it's very dysregulated. But if you're coming off of thyroid hormone, you should expect that it's going to take at least a few weeks, if not longer, to regain at least the signals that support your endogenous production. Now, I think the longer that you run it, I mean, like you increase the likelihood that lag is going to, be a longer duration. It's not to say that you run it, several years, that it's going to take several years in order to regain function because it works on a negative feedback mechanism. This is going to be something that in theory, it should come back on soon after discontinuing. But again, it is dependent on what your baseline function is. If your baseline function was kind of shitty before, I think that needs to be considered when establishing expectations. What point in prep should Clen be introduced? So what I'm going to say, like for myself, for my athletes, I'm more okay with introducing it early on. Yes, it's a fat loss tool. And if you want to go about it in a, as needed basis, you can, aim to get as much body fat as you want off prior to including it. But what I would really make sure that you're considering with the inclusion of Clen in a contest prep is that, frankly, you're putting it in to support the overarching goal, which is to lose body fat, which I find if we're trying to get a really good like rhythm in place with your rate of change, I would prefer to have that in earlier because then I can keep food a little bit higher. I can keep cardio a little bit lower, which ultimately you're going to need to escalate these two things as you get deeper into a contest prep. So that's just personal preference. I think at 20 micrograms, it's very reasonable for you to have it in place. I mean, like very early on during prep. Some people, they might demonize me for that. They might be like, yo, that's kind of reckless. It's a bronchodilator. I mean, like it's literally, it's not something that at a mild dose is going to cause you to experience symptoms that are any different than really any kind of stimulant. Okay, so when using Anavar for the first time, is it better to lose body fat first? Yeah, I mean, like generally what I would say is that if you're using Anavar in order to drive muscle growth, yeah, if you are in a position where body fat is too high, and let's say it's so high that either as you use it, you are going to be resistant to seeing the scale weight go up on account of, being uncomfortable with body fat levels where they are. That could definitely be a limiting factor in your ability to adequately drive hypertrophy. It's not to say like blanketly you can't use it if you're at a higher body fat and you can't make really good progress on it, but there is an upper limit to what I would say is like going to be a productive body fat to use it at. And that's really just comes down to, are you going to be able to stay motivated enough to commit to the cycle? So if you're doing an 8-week cycle and you find after the first like 3 to 4 weeks, scale weight's going up and you're like, yo, like I'm really fucking uncomfortable with scale weight. So now I'm going to do things that inadvertently put me in a deficit while using Anavar. I don't think that's productive. I would say generally for most people that come to me, they're in a position where they're like, I want to go through an intentional growth phase. I may or may not want to use PEDs. I'm certainly open to it, but I want to know that it's the right time for me. Like I want to know it's the right point in my career or relative to my aspirations. And because of that, I would say like it makes more sense if you're already uncomfortable even a little bit with your body fat. Let's put you in a position where you have enough runway to adequately commit to growing. Now, this doesn't mean like, hey, I'm going to put you in a surplus and you're going to be in this intentional growth phase, for the course of, let's say 12 months, and you're going to do so without ever, switching gears and, potentially entering into a short fat loss phase or mini cut. We could very well do that. And I find that to be very helpful in order to manage body fat as body fat comes on, even through a growth phase. But we need to have enough runway. So if the course of like 8 to 12 weeks or even 16 weeks, where maybe 8 of which you're going to be using an enhancement, if you can't commit to like that 16-week build because the first 8 weeks, yes, weight's going up. And by the time you get to the point where you would use Anavar and you essentially run into a mental hurdle where you're like, okay, I want to put it in, but like, I'm kind of like 3 to 5 pounds away from the heaviest I'd like to be. So at this point, if weight goes up at all, I'm going to, be a little hesitant. I'm going to be more reserved. And if that's the case, I think it can definitely be a benefit to lose body fat first and set yourself up so that once the anabolic goes in, you can really commit to that phase. What do you recommend postmenopausal women do with hormones? So in the case of someone who, let's say you feel like pretty trash, but you're like, hey, I want to get the most out of my efforts, that be in the gym, even just from a nutrition standpoint through your fat loss or lifestyle efforts. You just generally want to have a better physique. You want to improve your composition. I would first look at what lifestyle modifications could be made to support circulating endogenous production of these hormones. So it's not to say that postmenopausal, you're going to have no production of these hormones, but realistically, you are going to be downregulated in the sense the precursors, so pregnenolone, DHEA, those are going to be less prevalent, and you're likely going to see a decline in the prevalence of those hormones as you continue to age. So specifically, if we're looking at like adrenals versus ovarian production of these hormones, I would first establish, okay, like, can I do anything to support endogenous production? If that's been exploited, meaning like you're doing everything on the fatigue management front, you're getting enough adequate rest, you have a pretty systematic sleep-wake cycle that allows you to get good duration, adequate duration of high quality sleep. Okay, good. You've checked your box there. You need to make sure training volume is appropriate for what you can tolerate. So a lot of people who do come to me who are either perimenopausal, menopausal, postmenopausal, they've been training their entire life. Like they are accustomed to being in the gym 6-7 days a week. And I understand that, like that very well might be what you're used to, but we have to really weigh that against, are you eating enough to support what your output is relative to your goals? If you tell me that your goals are to get leaner, okay, well, you are going to be in a position where in the pursuit of getting leaner, depending on how lean you want to get, you might be in a way hormonally disadvantaged because you're circulating androgens, so DHEA, testosterone, those are not going to be as prevalent. Theoretically, like we could maybe assume that free test is also going to be on the lower side. We would want to go off lab work to really establish that as fact or, hypothesis. If you see that there are aspects that, just are, have kind of leveled off since going through menopause, and you're finding, okay, well, even despite backing down on training volume, backing down on cardio, eating a little bit more, giving yourself time to recover from your sessions. If you find that recovery is still poor, it could be worth supplementing, depending on where the deficit is, primarily with something like a precursor, so like DHEA. You're not going to have that as prevalent of an endogenous production of estradiol as that's going to come from the ovaries, or that's going to be produced in the ovaries. So it's certainly something to consider, but you could very well consider HRT, but again, like I wouldn't just say blanketly across the board that because you're postmenopausal, that indicates that you should be on, all three fronts of HRT. So testosterone replacement therapy, progesterone replacement therapy, estradiol replacement therapy. I would say it really is going to depend on symptoms as well. So if you're someone who, naturally you just find like, hey, you do struggle with even like adult acne, you've experienced those likely just more natural occurrences of androgenicity due to menopause, so darker facial hair, a lower sex drive. I guess I shouldn't really say that because that's not directly tied to an androgenic effect, but it's more of an effect of just going through menopause. So lower sex drive, vaginal dryness, if those are things that are indicating, hey, like you're very deficient in one of these areas, you could potentially start by correcting the one area that you're deficient in and seeing if that yields enough of an improvement. I would say though, at a baseline, if levels have been suppressed for an extended period of time and you've tried lifestyle modifications as an intervention and you're finding that like, okay, this is really beginning to impact my quality of life. And, you're at the point where like, okay, I am ready to commit to HRT as more of a lifelong therapy. Then I think you would be at the point where you can consider in what avenues you want to broach that. So whether that is testosterone and estradiol or testosterone and progesterone, ultimately that's going to be up to you and your provider or whoever you're working with. But I do think that when we're talking about someone who is frequently competing or exposing themselves to these states of low energy availability, it would make sense to have supportive therapy in place. And even at the point where you're done competing and you're like, okay, I competed through menopause, maybe even competed into post-menopause for an extended duration, you likely would be looking at requiring that supportive therapy moving forward. So Anavar, 15 milligrams a week for a 6-week cycle, just as a foundation. Your thoughts? I'm not a big fan of that. In the case of the female athlete, I think 15 milligrams is much too high. I think that is a very short duration of use. It's not to say that you can't use it for 6 weeks, but really what I consider with athletes who do err on the side of like, I just want to do it for 4 weeks or 6-week cycles. It's like, okay, well, how much muscle do you need? If you need a high degree of muscle and you're planning to just use this for that shorter duration, is it really worth it? Like, are you going to meet your goals by exposing yourself for that amount of time? Personally, if we're talking about a foundation, I would recommend starting with TRT only because we can gauge efficacy and your response and whether or not there are any kind of androgenic side effects that just simply occur from being at a higher serum level of testosterone than whatever your baseline is. Now, I know some people are probably like, whoa, it's TRT, like I'm not supposed to incur side effects. Well, no, you're not supposed to, but there's some individuals who are more sensitive to changes in free testosterone and just overall serum levels as they increase. So if you're someone who's like, hey, I at baseline at a very like low level of testosterone, I tend to struggle with acne, I tend to struggle with darker facial hair growth, body hair growth, that would be something I would want to escalate up systematically based on tolerance, while still respecting the fact that over 100 nanograms per deciliter, that's likely going to, it's going to put you at probability of incurring these side effects. Yet, just because we can go up to 100 nanograms per deciliter doesn't mean that every person is going to be able to tolerate such a high degree of circulating testosterone on account of their free test being higher relative to others and relative to what they consider is an acceptable incurrence of any of those mostly reversible effects. Now, when we look at Anavar at 15 milligrams, I think this is much too great. I personally think that if we're talking about like, you just wanting to establish a foundation, I think we really have to consider what is the ROI on having such a high dose in place for a short amount of time. Just because you've tripled your dose, like from what I would say is generally the starting dose, like 5 milligrams, but even more so, like for someone who's more risk averse, potentially 2.5 milligrams. If you're going up to 15 just out the gate, if it's your first exposure, I certainly think that this is overkill. And I think that there's going to be a high probability of virilization. And I think truly, if you are in need of putting such a high dose in place, that's something that you need to be very privy to the risk and the exposure that you're incurring even within that 6-week cycle. During prep, sometimes my period stops, but can have one very short cycle for like 12 days. So I mean, like during contest prep, you have to consider is like your menstrual cycle is not a critical function. And depending on your tolerance for being in a calorie deficit, being at a very high output, which I think we can just infer that like if you're in contest prep, the goal is to get to a very low body fat percentage for stage, depending on where your natural body fat set point is at, like the place in which you feel good, the place in which hunger signaling is generally tolerable. The further and further you get away from that set point, the greater likelihood there is that you're going to experience hormonal dysregulation. So that's going to predominantly affect your cycle. And if you're someone who, even outside of contest prep, is not very regular, I would say that you are taking on even more of a risk, because putting yourself in that extreme state, even though that cognitively you might be able to tolerate it, even if physically you're like, well, yeah, it's uncomfortable, but I don't feel like I'm dying. Well, it's like, okay, yeah, technically you might feel that way. You might very much believe that, and that's valid. But at the same time, your body is much smarter than you, and it's going to work in a way that protects you. It's not going to work in a way that's conducive with you doing better on stage. So, I say this a lot, that like prep exacerbates HPA dysregulation. So typically we say HPA and HPO dysregulation occur in athletes who tend to be less resilient. There are some athletes who go in and out of contest prep very systematically and don't experience anovulation, but simply going off whether or not you get a period, I mean, that is one avenue, but I would really look towards blood work to determine if you're experiencing that natural rise and fall of progesterone and estradiol. If you're not seeing that despite getting a period, that indicates that there very well might be dysregulation even outside of contest prep. So what I would do is, one, identify what your baseline is when you're ovulating, identify really if ovulation is occurring outside of prep, and then whatever can be done to sustain and protect ovulation outside of prep. Yes, that needs to be done if it's not already being done. But then on top of that, past that, is putting yourself in a position where you are not taking unnecessary extremes in order to bring the physique that you want to bring to stage. If you're having to take a lot of extremes, if you're having to put yourself in a very excessive, a very vast deficit in order to see that target rated change, it could be that initially maybe you're starting in some kind of deficit hormonally, like maybe certain hormones are already suppressed entering prep. This in itself is why I like people to get that baseline lab work pre-prep. I think it's very telling and can really paint a picture as to what we can expect in terms of dysregulation and adaptations. Is enclomiphene and HCG cycle worth running? So this is a female asking this, and what I can say is like my understanding around enclomiphene is that it can raise natural testosterone levels. I know there's some studies that show there's a pretty significant increase in older males who are who do have low testosterone. Now, where I would just be really careful with this information is that you do have providers, you have clinics who are able to prescribe enclomiphene, and like certainly for the male athlete, this might be something that does make sense based on your goal. But I would say that inadvertently having it in place, it's probably not going to raise you to a point if your expectations are that of taking TRT, just A to B, like you're just injecting whatever ester of testosterone that you select. Enclomiphene, yes, it's been shown to raise tests, just not to the degree that TRT has. In terms of HCG, I mean, that's something that if you were potentially looking at regaining fertility after being, let's say, exposed to TRT for an extended period of time, sure, that can be helpful, but different protocols for different individuals and different needs. That's not something that I personally am, met with on a regular basis. I do have some clients who they have used TRT in the past or continuing to use it. And yes, while fertility is something that they want to protect, just simply having it in place blindly isn't necessarily a good recommendation, just because that endogenous production is being shut off. Just simply having the exogenous production in place, I would say really what's going to be your best bet is if you have any kind of baseline relative to your fertility as a male athlete, whether that be a fertility analysis, some kind of diagnostics related to sperm count, sperm motility, that's going to be telling as to whether or not a PCT, like a true extensive PCT with something like enclomiphene and HCG, even past that, there are other avenues that you can go as needed. But I would say this is something that, again, you should work with a provider on, and you should make sure that it is tailored to your needs, not something that you just blindly put in place. How do pros stay on Clen for long periods of time, if at all? So, I mean, like, it's a little bit of a loaded question. I can't tell you that that's something like all pros do. Personally, like with clenbuterol, yes, I've used it in contest prep. I've used it for fat loss phases, but it's not something I just have in place year round. It's not to say that you can't. It's not to say that inadvertently just being exposed to it for a certain duration is as risky as, let's say, putting in an anabolic. Clenbuterol, it's a bronchodilator. It is going to offer fat loss benefits, but really when it comes to speculating why pros or how pros are able to keep it in year round, you would really have to ask them. And that's something like, sure, I can tell you, I've heard of other professional bikini competitors, professional wellness competitors who they tend to just keep it in place to allow their calorie intake to rise even when they're in a growth phase. I see it as kind of redundant. It's a fat loss tool, so I think it does need to be indicated if we're going to have it in place. If you're someone that's like, hey, I'm really petite, I'm on the smaller side, and it's very hard for me to stay adherent, given that my food tends to stay pretty low even when I'm not in prep. I've definitely heard of it being used in off season just as a way to create a little bit of a buffer. But that would be something, again, like is put in place after several lifestyle interventions and dietary interventions have been modified, adjusted, and attempted. I do have a couple clients who are in that, who are just smaller stature, and they are, under 5 foot. And it's like, yeah, like, hey, I get it. Like your BMR is very, very small. On top of that, if we're trying to reduce cardio to manage fatigue, if we can have something in place that gives you a little bit of wiggle room, sure. But then you really have to ask, okay, if this is having any kind of negative impact on recovery or sleep, is it really worth putting in place? Can muscle growth be an effective clen? I mean, like, yeah, clen does work on the mTOR pathway. So, I mean, there could be transient effects that are related to building. And I would say maybe this is something that is highlighted interested in an athlete who's never used anabolics, if it's someone who's doing everything right and they're, checking all their boxes relative to muscle growth, sure, I could see there being a very mild effect relative to muscle growth. But is it something that I would say blanketly is a good tool for growth? Not necessarily. It's going to increase basal metabolic rate. So if you're someone that is kind of teetering on that line of like deficit maintenance and you're a little bit timid when it comes to putting yourself in a surplus, I think that in itself would be a really poor, like that would be a use case of someone who probably shouldn't put Clen in place, only because it's very difficult for them already to eat enough to support muscle growth. In itself, like it's not going to create that much more of a deficit. It'll create some of a deficit, which frankly, if you're in a contest prep or if you're in a fat loss phase period, this could be something that's very favorable. But if the goal is to gain weight and Clen inadvertently is eating up some of those reserves, I would say that it's an inappropriate use for it. How long would you cycle on Clen for? So this is really relative to the phase that you're in. So kind of piggybacking off of the last question, I mean, if the goal is fat loss, I think it makes sense to have it in place. I think it can serve a really good value there because it's going to allow you to keep food a little bit higher. It's going to mitigate some of the need to drive up cardio, at least especially early on in a prep. So I think that's a good use for it. I would say for contest prep, it does make sense to have it in place because it has some muscle retentive properties, which I think are often overshadowed by its ability to increase basal metabolic rate. Now, in the case of someone who wants to continue it throughout their off season, again, it goes back to if the goal is to build muscle, well, it's going to be taking away from your ability to do that in a very mild fashion. So is it worth continuing to have it in place, especially if we're talking about like higher doses, like 40, 60, or 80 micrograms? I don't think it makes a lot of sense, but again, to each is their own. There are individuals who I could definitely make an argument for keeping it in place. My coach lab told me to take levothyroxine, but I feel horrible on that. Is this a red flag? So I think it really comes down to what you mean by you feel horrible on it. What is the dose? I mean, like if you were taking the appropriate dose, maybe it does make sense. Generally, if you're someone who has any kind of suppressed thyroid function, I think adding in something like T4 or T3 or combination therapy can be beneficial in terms of like symptom correction, symptom mitigation, overall well-being. But granted, if you're saying that you feel horrible in the sense like, oh, it's impacting your sleep and you're finding that like you just feel very wired, very shaky, and it could be as simple as going down on the dose. I'd also look at when you're administering. If you're taking it, which for listeners, this is an oral tablet, this is not something that you need to inject. If you're taking it any other time outside of AM and you're experiencing side effects related to and impacting sleep, then I would start by taking it earlier in the day. I think it's one of those things that like oftentimes even people who have very normal thyroid function, they'll be put in a position where they go to a clinic, they go to a coach and say, I want to lose body fat. And oftentimes the intervention that's recommended is, okay, well, thyroid looks like it could be a little faster. Let's put some kind of thyroid support in place. Now, if it's not needed, it could just very well be that it's not needed. And even though you're struggling to lose body fat, simply correcting with thyroid support is too extreme of an intervention. And then in that case, I would look at why or why not you feel like you're struggling to lose fat, if that's even what the problem was that you presented to the coach slash lab. Do you have any advice on how to rebound naturally after taking PEDs? It kind of depends on what PEDs we're talking about. So if we're talking about removing an anabolic, I mean, this is something that, frankly, there's going to be some come down in both like the physique and the changes in the composition, because you're probably not going to retain 100% of what you saw, what you experienced while on cycle. Removing it, a lot of people do report that it's pretty discouraging. They're like, okay, well, yeah, I may have built some muscle, but I still don't have that same pop. And that's something that I know it can be mentally very hard. But the reality is, like, your opportunity cost of just leaving it in is, if you do decide to leave it in, you're looking at potentially exposing yourself to the risk of virilization. Whereas making sure that, okay, I'm getting the most out of it while it's in, knowing that the look I have is going to be very enhanced, very augmented. And even if I retain 80% of that look, okay, that's good enough for me. I think that you need to have a very level head when it comes to expectations post-cycle. I think for one, putting yourself in a position where you're only running it for the duration that is truly needed, putting yourself in a position where you can capitalize on building muscle is a good way to avoid really that rebound post-cycle. A lot of people who remove it post prep, I mean, like, they're going to find that, like, yeah, like I got really lean and I had a really good fullness and depth to my muscles. And then as soon as I remove it, it feels like I lost a bunch of muscle. Well, it really wasn't muscle that you put on. I mean, like, it can be pretty powerful. And like in the case where I've used 2.5 milligrams of Anavar, 5 milligrams of Anavar, once removing it, I mean, that pop dissipates pretty quickly. Now, if we're talking about removing a different kind of PED, a non-androgenic, it really depends on the kind of PED we're talking about and the effect that we got from that PED. If it's something like a fat loss agent, Clen, T4, T3, you can expect slight downregulation of what felt like metabolic function in the case of thyroid hormone, that quite literally is metabolic function, but you're removing something that was altering the state, I guess, really the balance of energy that you were in at the point of taking it. So by removing it, yes, you're going to have to be more conservative with food if the goal is to try to mitigate any unnecessary body fat gain. But this isn't something that is going to be like a 500 calorie difference. I mean, unless we're talking about very high doses of maybe both those drugs, and you're talking about like using them for an extended duration of time, in addition to at the point of removal, also lowering cardio, also increasing food dramatically. Yeah, I mean, like that rebound itself could be pretty abrupt and mentally very challenging to deal with. So that's where I would take more of a conservative approach, rather than remove both at the same time, in addition to a decrease in cardio, increasing food. I would go about it in a very systematic fashion. So I would potentially remove the Clen, drop off some of the cardio. Yeah, raise food, but not to, an excessive point. Maybe leave the T4, T3 in after the show for maybe a week or two. But once you've leveled out, once you've found, some stable footing, maybe then at that point, remove the T4, T3. Ultimately, you're going to see the weight come back on. And I know that can be very off-putting, especially if it's something that you struggle with. But that's where I think that being more conservative will favor you in the long run.